Welcome, everyone. Today we're exploring one of the strangest and most tragic industrial disasters in American history, an event so surreal it sounds almost fictional. Imagine a 15-foot wave of thick, sticky molasses moving at over 30 miles an hour through a dense urban neighborhood. That is exactly what happened in Boston's North End on January 15, 1919, at roughly 12:40 in the afternoon. Over the next several minutes, we'll unpack not just what happened that day, but why it happened, and how this bizarre flood of syrup changed the way American courts hold corporations accountable. Let's begin. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll begin by setting the scene. What unfolded on that January afternoon in Boston's North End, the neighborhood, the tank, and the deadly wave itself. Then we'll dig into the forensic question. Why did a 50-foot steel tank suddenly tear apart? The answer involves shoddy engineering, ignored warnings, and corporate cost-cutting. Finally, we'll examine the aftermath, the grueling rescue, the months-long cleanup, and a landmark legal battle that set new standards for corporate liability in the United States. Let's begin by setting the scene. Boston, January 1919. The First World War had ended just 2 months earlier, and the city was still very much a wartime industrial hub. The North End was a dense, working-class immigrant neighborhood, Italians, Irish, and Jewish families packed into tenements alongside factories, warehouses, and the elevated railway. And on Commercial Street stood a massive steel tank, 50 feet tall, filled to the brim with molasses. No one in that neighborhood knew they were living next to a ticking time bomb. To understand why this disaster happened, you need to understand the context. The Purity Distilling Company operated this tank as part of the wartime industrial alcohol supply chain. Molasses was not just for baking, it was a strategic raw material used to produce ethanol for smokeless powder and other military explosives. Demand had been enormous during World War I, and the company had built the tank quickly in 1915 to capitalize on government contracts. The surrounding neighborhood was among the densest in Boston. Imagine homes, shops, and a firehouse all sitting literally in the shadow of a 50-foot tank holding over 2 million gallons of fluid. When the tank was topped off just days before the collapse, no one raised a flag. But they should have. Let me give you a sense of the scale. Picture a cylinder 50 feet high and 90 feet across. That's roughly the footprint of an NBA basketball court, standing 5 stories tall. Inside, 2.3 million gallons of molasses, weighing approximately 13,000 tons. Now here is the critical detail. The steel at the bottom, where pressure was greatest, was just half an inch thick. From day one, this tank leaked so badly that neighborhood kids would bring cans and buckets to collect the sweet syrup oozing from its seams. Instead of fixing the problem, the company literally painted the entire tank brown so the leaks would be less visible. Think about that for a moment. They camouflaged a structural emergency. Now, let's talk about the moment of collapse. Witnesses described a sound like a machine gun, a deep metallic roar, followed by what the Boston Post called a rumble, a hiss, and then a swish. In a matter of seconds, the entire tank tore open, and 2.3 million gallons surged outward as a 15-foot wall of molasses. It moved at an estimated 35 miles per hour. Faster than a person can run. The wave was powerful enough to sweep buildings off their foundations, knock a railroad car off the elevated tracks, and lift the Engine 31 firehouse right off its base. And molasses weighs roughly 13 pounds per gallon, so this was not a gentle syrup. It was a dense, heavy, suffocating mass that trapped and crushed everything in its path. If you fell into it, the cooling molasses thickened around you like quicksand. Escape was nearly impossible. The numbers are stark. 21 people died that afternoon, workers on their lunch breaks, a 10-year-old boy named Pasquale Antosca, who was collecting firewood near the tank, horses stabled in nearby buildings, and city workers simply going about their day. 150 more suffered injuries ranging from broken bones to severe burns, because the molasses had been warm when it burst out, and as it cooled, it became a sticky, suffocating trap. The property damage, when adjusted for inflation, exceeded $100 million in today's terms. The cleanup alone took over 80,000 man-hours. Crews used salt water pumped from Boston Harbor and fire hoses to wash the syrup from the streets. and for months afterward, the entire city reportedly smelled of molasses. So what caused a 50-foot steel tank to tear apart so catastrophically? Was this an act of God, an unpredictable industrial accident, or something far more preventable? The answer, as a 5-year investigation would ultimately prove, lies in a cascade of engineering failures, deliberate cost-cutting, and warning signs that were ignored for years. Let's walk through exactly what went wrong. Investigators identified a chain of 4 critical failures that made the collapse virtually certain. First, the steel walls. At the base, where fluid pressure is greatest, the tank's walls were only half an inch thick. For a vessel holding 13,000 tons of molasses, that was grossly inadequate. Second, the rivets. They had been poorly installed from the start and began cracking under stress almost immediately, which is why molasses leaked constantly. Third, no one ever conducted a basic water fill test. The industry standard safety check, where you fill a tank with water first to see if it holds, they simply filled it with molasses and hoped for the best. And fourth, weather. The day of the disaster saw a dramatic temperature swing, from near freezing in the morning to the mid-40s by noon. The warming molasses expanded, and that thermal expansion was the final straw that pushed the already weakened tank past its breaking point. Here is the detail that transforms this from tragedy to outrage. The tank leaked from day one, so badly that neighborhood children collected molasses in cans and brought it home to their mothers. Residents heard the tank groan and shudder every time it was filled. They complained. The company's response? They painted the tank brown. Not to protect the steel, purely to camouflage the leaks so they would be less visible. When expert engineers later examined the tank's wreckage and construction records, their conclusion was damning. This tank was built without proper engineering plans, without professional oversight, and in flagrant violation of even the basic safety standards of 1915. The disaster was not an accident. It was a predictable consequence of deliberate negligence. But out of this tragedy came lasting change. The rescue was grueling. Firefighters, police, and volunteers waded through waist-deep molasses searching for survivors for days. The cleanup took months, and then came the reckoning. 119 lawsuits consolidated into a single epic hearing that would stretch across 5 years and fundamentally reshape American tort law. Let's look at how the legal battle unfolded. The legal battle was extraordinary in both scale and significance. Within days, the first lawsuits hit the courts. Eventually, 119 separate claims were consolidated into a single massive proceeding. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company mounted a creative defense. They blamed anarchists. Remember, this was 1919, the height of the Red Scare, and the company claimed a bomb had destroyed the tank. It was a cynical ploy, but it forced investigators to prove otherwise. Expert engineers and metallurgists examined the wreckage and demonstrated conclusively that the tank had failed from within due to structural negligence, not external attack. After nearly 5 years of hearings, one of the longest civil proceedings in Massachusetts history up to that point, the company was found fully liable and ordered to pay $628,000. That's roughly $9 million in today's currency. More important than the money was the legal precedent. American courts had affirmed in the clearest possible terms that corporations cannot hide behind complexity or blame shifting when they knowingly compromise public safety. I want to close with a reflection on why this story matters. 107 years later. The Great Molasses Flood is often remembered as a quirky piece of trivia, a bizarre disaster that sounds almost comedic. But it is not a comedy. It is a cautionary tale. 21 people died because a company chose to save money rather than build a safe tank, then painted over the evidence rather than fix it. Their deaths led directly to stricter building codes, mandatory engineering certifications, and a legal framework that says, if you cut corners and people die, you will be held accountable. That principle is now embedded in American law and has protected countless lives in the centuries since. When we talk about red tape and overregulation, the molasses flood reminds us what those regulations are built on. Thank you.